Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the metaphysics of the ascension of Jesus. And that may sound like, a cool topic to you, or it may sound like, oh, is this going to be really complex? I think whatever level you're at, we're going to try and get you interested in this. This is a very interesting topic. And my guest is Cruz Davis. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to meet you. You are friends with Justin Mooney, right?
That is correct. Yeah.
You both go to the same university, and Justin just finished his PhD. Where are you at in the process?
I'm just a year behind Justin, so I'll either finish up this upcoming year or the year after.
Okay, cool. So I guess before we get into the paper that we're discussing, I'll go ahead and mention it now. So this paper is not published yet, right? It's just forthcoming.
Neither. I'm waiting to hear back on.
You're waiting to hear back. Okay,
Yeah.
I got you. So it's on the metaphysics of the ascension. I'm not sure what. I guess that's Latin at the top.
Yeah. Ubi est corpus Christi means where is the body of Christ?
Where is the body of Christ? Oh,
Yeah.
I would have titled the video that if I knew what Ubi est Christi, Corpus Christi meant.
Yeah.
So how did you get interested in the topic of the ascension?
Right. So when I was an undergrad, I used to lead this interfaith group that had people from different religions, atheists, theists, and so on. And they come together and we discuss various bits of Christian theology and try to get to know about different theological or philosophical positions that people in the other groups had. And one of the things that I used to do in the fall was I'd lead the discussions on Christian theology, and we'd go through the Nicene Creed. And we'd basically go through line by line, and I'd talk a little bit about the historical and theological backgrounds, but then I'd bring up various philosophical puzzles having to do with each of the theological commitments. And then I stumbled across, and he ascended into heaven, right? I'm thinking to myself, I haven't seen anything on this before. And the more I think about it, the weirder it just seems. It's hard to put a finger on what exactly is weird about it. But I mean, there's a very clear and straightforward question, which is, where did his body go? And so I went and dug around throughout a bunch of places where I thought I'd be able to find something saying stuff about philosophical issues related to the ascension. And I was pretty much just not able to find anything. There's like a couple of paragraphs in a book by Hud Hudson. Swinburne says something that's like maybe a paragraph long. And then William Lane Craig had a couple of things on his website about this that were just due to various questions that people asked. What I did find, actually, though, which I thought was kind of funny, is there is some extensive work on the Assumption of Mary that Catholic philosophers have gotten into. In particular, John Haldane has an entire paper on how to understand the Assumption of Mary and how to make sense out of it. But yeah, since there's nothing there, I figured I wanted to, try to figure out what's puzzling about it and what we should say about the ascension, if anything at all. Should we leave it open, or should we take some various particular positions, and ended up thinking that the kind of position that we're going to have to end up with is relatively surprising, but something that can be well motivated.
Yeah. Your solution is going to be really intriguing to the viewers, I'm sure. Okay, just to give the viewer a sense of the overview of this interview, here's how it's going to work. It's broken into 3 parts. So in part 1, we're going to lay out the problem of the ascension. In part 2, we're going to look at in part 1 we're laying out just what the doctrine of the ascension is. In part 2, we're looking at the problem that it presents, like what's the problem facing it. And then in part 3, we're looking at responses to the problem. So that's how this interview is broken up. So let's start with the doctrine itself. What exactly are you talking about when you talk about the doctrine of the ascension?
Yeah, so after Christ was resurrected from the dead, he went and ministered to people for 40 days, and then was taken up before the disciples bodily into heaven. So we have this incorruptible resurrection body that is then assumed into the divine realm, whatever that means. Things like this are talked about elsewhere. I mean, so there's the tradition of Enoch being translated into heaven. Same thing with Elijah. The thing that I think is distinctive about the case with Christ is it's very clear that when this transition happens, it seems like you can't get rid of the bodily aspect of it. The change from being within creation to heaven has to be, or at least at face value, has to be consistent with Christ still having a body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what then is the problem? You said, I think many people might think, yeah, there's something strange about this, how this works, but what's the problem specifically?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so as I said earlier, the thing that intuitively sticks out is like, okay, so where did he go? Right. It's not like eventually the Hubble telescope's going to find Jesus's body floating around some planet or asteroid or something like that, or there's going to be, basically like how they have Asgard depicted in Marvel, just some sort of like city in the clouds that's floating in the midst of space. And then, once Hubble gets far enough out there, it's going to see, oh, that's where Christ's hanging out.
Yeah.
There's something that seems profane about that kind of an idea. Some people have floated things like that. Like I think Wayne Grudem says something along these lines. But yeah, like it's kind of like you've got this rocket ship Jesus idea. He shoots off. So one of the things I wanted to do was try to figure out how exactly to say why you might find something like this profane, or why you might find it puzzling, that doesn't allow for such a like simple, straightforward solution like that. And I think that there's 3 claims that we're committed to that when held together, it looks like they lead to a contradiction. So here are the 3 claims. The first is just the doctrine of the ascension, which we'll call bodily ascension. It says Christ has a physical body and it's entirely within heaven, right? So he's physical, and that physical body is in heaven, right? The second claim that's something that I take to be intuitive is that heaven isn't something that's located within space or time, or just like within your standard 3-dimensional space that we're familiar with. It's the realm of spirits. It's, God's special abode, things like that. As I said, there seems to be something about like this idea that eventually we'll bump into heaven via space exploration that seems weird to me, and not like the kind of thing that you'd want to accept as a traditional Christian. And then the last claim is materiality. And this is a condition on what it is for something to be material that is generally well accepted, which is necessarily anything with a physical body, or anything that's a material object, has a location within space. Material objects, physical bodies, I'm treating that roughly as the same sort of thing. They're the kinds of things that we see that have spatial dimensions, and are either defined in terms of having spatial dimension, or at least typically have been, or having just some sort of location within space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then from these three, you argue in the paper this forms an inconsistent set.
Yeah.
So
Right.
elaborate how do we get a contradiction out of these three?
Yeah. So Christ is, so break up bodily ascension, right? Christ is entirely in heaven. So that means that he has to be, in some sense, located there, right? But if heaven isn't a spatial location, it can't be the case that this the place where Christ's body is spatial in by any way, shape, or form. However, bodily ascension also tells us that Christ has a physical body. His body is a material object. So by materiality, it has to be the case that his body has a spatial location. And then you can see very quickly that once we accept these three claims together, it looks like we're going to be committed to the contradiction that Christ is both spatially located and not spatially located.
Yeah. So by 1 and 2, Christ has a spatial location, but by 1 and 3, Christ does not have a spatial location.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Now, that's the problem in a nutshell. You get this contradiction. And the thing is, all three of these claims, at least, they seem like they're pretty plausible on the face of it. You look at that and you're like, yeah, I can see all three of those. Those seem plausible. So what we're going to do for the remainder of the interview is look at potential solutions to this problem. So why don't we turn to that now?
Yeah, let me say something real quick about methodology here, because I think that, as you said, each of the claims, at least if you're a Christian, you're going to say that each of them is plausible, right? We're committed to one. It looks like by just a straightforward reading of the scripture, the creeds commit us to it. We're committed to just based upon intuitive reflection about what heaven would have to be like, and we're committed to 3 based on some pretty straightforward, non-revisionary claims about the metaphysics of physical or material objects. So in resolving issues like this, you're going to want it to be the case that we don't do it in an ad hoc way that results in some sort of unnecessary philosophical revisionism, or leads us into theological heterodoxy. And so that's going to be the rough constraints we're going to want to work with. The way that I approached the issue was I took it to be the case that it's fine to give something that's metaphysically revisionary just so long as it's independently motivated from the theological claims, and that we should ground what's heterodox versus not heterodox based upon some pretty well-established claims that take place in Christian soteriology, which is the doctrine of salvation.
Yeah, that was helpful to clarify that. Okay, let's start talking about solutions. So in the paper, you discuss 4 types of solutions, and in the end, you only opt for one of them. You think one of them has the best chance of resolving this issue. But we're going to discuss all 4. So maybe if you want, just like give a broad picture of like the 4 types of responses, and then we'll get into each one in particular.
Yeah. So whenever you're faced with a contradiction, you can either find some way to deny plausibly one of the claims that lead you to that. or you could try to find a way to reread the premises that lead to the contradiction in such a way that they end up being compatible with one another. Out of the four solutions, we have three that deny each of the claims some bit of bodily ascension, something about the location of heaven, so they deny either one or two, or they deny that material bodies need to be located by necessity. A different way of going about it is to reread what the claims mean in such a way so that they end up all being compatible. And this is what what I'm calling ubiquitism. It's a claim that goes back to Luther, ends up doing, where he understands what it is to be located in heaven in a way that's compatible with also having a spatial location as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's start with what you call anti-corporealism. So this is going to deny the bodily ascension, specifically the way that claim is stated. Christ has a physical body and it's entirely in heaven. They're going to deny this claim. So yeah, elaborate on this. What goes
Right.
on in this
Yeah.
response?
So what they do is they deny the bodily part of the bodily ascension. So Christ ascended into heaven. They don't deny that, but they don't think that you need to take on the extra bit that requires you to say that he has a physical body. Now, there's four different versions of this that I consider. And I think, like, given what I said about the methodology, the first one, which I have a little line through, gives a really clear and straightforward way of seeing how we want to stay within certain theological commitments. So the first claim is called Anti-Incarnationalism, or at least that's what I'm calling it. And it's an idea that I you can kind of see it floated in what Swinburne has to say. He offers a couple of different ways of understanding the ascension, but one of the things that he says is like, oh, or we could just understand it to be the case that for a period of time, when Christ ascends, he just goes back to being the second person of the Trinity. And I think there's reason for why he does this. He's got a Christology where Christ is a human body plus the second person of the Trinity. The second person of the Trinity just plays the role of the soul for Christ. At least that's what I understand. But I think that this really straightforwardly ends up running into issues with our soteriology. It undercuts the current role that Christ is supposed to be playing as our high priest and intercessor. He doesn't play that role qua divine. He plays that qua human. He's supposed to be the representative of humanity via his human nature to the Godhead. And so we lose this important role that Christ is supposed to be playing if we assume that he gives up his human nature completely and just goes back to being entirely divine. So that's why I think we should just like rule that out from the beginning. This is something that I think like even intuitively most Christians are just going to think of as something that's theologically repugnant. So instead, there's a few different ways of understanding how you can deny one, two of which I found that other people say, and one I haven't been able to find anybody that says exactly this. And the first is naive anti-corporealism, which is just that when Christ goes up to heaven, he loses his physical body. He just has a human soul, right? And his nature takes place entirely. His human nature takes place entirely within the human soul. no physical body to accompany it. Nobody that I've been able to find says that, but I think it's important to illustrate different ways that you can develop an anti-corporealist view. And the two other ways I'm going to call manifestationalism and non-manifestationalism. Perhaps I could have named these better, but here's how I understand the views. Manifestationalism is something that gets floated by John Haldane about Mary and Mary's relationship to her body. He thinks it's the case that Mary ceases to have a physical location. So, and we're just going to translate all of this, the Mary stuff, to what we're going to say about Christ's body. So Haldane would say that Christ's body ceases to have a physical location, and so it ceases to have a physical body. However, it has powers that are manifest that go beyond normal powers of the human spirit or powers of the human soul. And these powers are the kinds of powers that are associated with having a physical body. The ability to manifest in space, or to move objects around in a particular way. You might think that these are all ways that one can manifest themselves in a bodily way without having a body. The non-manifestationalist understanding is that Christ isn't divided, his human nature isn't divided up necessarily into body and soul. Rather, there's ways in which his human nature can become manifest. And this is the view that it seems like William Lane Craig supports. When Christ's body, when Christ's human nature is within space-time, it manifests itself bodily. But when you take that nature out of space-time, it no longer does that. So it's not like there's a change in the nature per se. Rather, it's a change in the conditions through which that nature becomes manifest. The way that he likes to cash it out is that there isn't an intrinsic change in Christ's human nature. Rather, it's just all due to different extrinsic features. I mean, we can talk about this later. I think that that's a really bad way of cashing out or thinking about things, but there's all sorts of intrinsic changes going on when, my spatial relations between my parts are intrinsic. But yeah, that's the kind of view that William Lane Craig supports.
Why don't we cash it out now? Because what I'd like to do for each one of these responses is, as we go through it, you offer summarize the view and then critique it. So what's your critique, I guess, of manifestationism and also your critique of non-manifestationism?
Yeah, so the non-manifestationism, so there's the thing that I said about intrinsic properties. I think that you can't, part of the intrinsic features of me include ways that my body relates to itself, right? But I think that you can actually just offer one big argument against this entire anti-corporealist picture. And that's what I think is probably the best way to go. Just so I don't end up strapping people like Craig with things that he doesn't actually think. And really what I think the problem is that they face a dilemma. Actually, sorry, let me take a quick step back. First of all, anti-corporealism is denied just throughout church history by the fathers. So you've got passages from Gregory Nazianzus and John of Damascus, where they very clearly say, no, it's bodily at the right hand of God. And then they go and explain what that means in a way that's supposed to get around or explain how Christ could be bodily at the right hand of God. But yeah, let's get back to that dilemma. So let's think about what different views of the human nature can be. So on the one end, you could be some type of materialist, either a reductive materialist or a non-reductive one, like you're a functionalist or something like that. And so the human nature is based entirely in our physical bodies. Or you could be a dualist of some sort and say that our nature is boiled down to us having some sort of physical and non-physical aspect. Those are the two big pictures that are on the board. Now, there's a way to extend this dilemma beyond this, but I think that, pretty much everybody's going to fall on one side or the other. So anti-corporealism ends up running into some sort of theologically problematic claims if you take either way of viewing human nature. So on the one end, you could say that human nature is entirely based on our physical aspect and be a materialist. But if you're an anti-corporealist, then you're going to have to say that that aspect's been given up, right? And it follows from that if you're an anti-corporealist and a materialist, you're going to have to say that Christ gave up his human nature. But then that just makes all these other three versions of anti-corporealism bottom out in anti-incarnationalism, which we've already seen is a pretty bad thing to accept. This is not something that you want to take on. On the other hand, say that we're dualists about human nature. So we think that we're like based on a body and a soul, or, we have both fundamental mental and physical properties, right? But if you're an anti-corporealist, then you're going to want to say that Christ's non-material aspect, his soul, has been separated from and now exists apart from his material aspect, his body. But traditionally, the thought is that whenever your body and soul are apart, you're dead, right? So if you're an anti-corporealist and a dualist, it looks like you're committed to the claim that Christ is dead. Now, if that isn't a heterodox claim, I don't know what is. Christ is the defeater of death. He's the source of life. We require him to be continually living because he's our living savior. We get life through participating in his resurrection. And so I think that either way, you're going to end up saying something theologically problematic. Either Christ abandons human nature, that's bad, or Christ is dead. That's really bad. So that's why I don't think anti-corporealism is a viable option.
Yeah, and it seems like you would, with respect to the dualist end of that dilemma, it seems like the dualist might have to add a claim to the view that sounds just kind of ad hoc. So it's like, well, if the soul is separated from the body, in space-time or something like that, then you're considered dead. But outside of space-time, if the soul does not have a body, then you're not. That's not sufficient to be considered dead.
Right.
You'd probably have to say something like that to try.
Yeah, but I mean, so think if you do say something like that, one of the things that you're going to have to claim is that the souls of the saints aren't going to heaven, right? Because that's where Christ's soul is going, right? According to the anti-corporealist view. Maybe what they mean to say is something like, it's not like the case that there's ever a dead body. But then it's unclear what they would say to differentiate their view from somebody who just got like evaporated. There was never a dead body in that case. So it's like, say I've got some sort of like sci-fi stun ray or something like that, and it instantly disintegrates your body. So that there's like, just like the exact second it hits you, you're gone. Your soul goes up to heaven or whatever. There's no dead body. That would seem to imply, the kind of response that they're making would seem to imply that you would have to still be alive in that case. But that's clearly false.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is anti-corporealism, and you gave some reasons to think that view is incorrect, or not very plausible. So now let's turn to the second response, which is locationalism. Locationalism denies two, and I'll put two up on the screen again. So two says heaven is not a spatial location. So if you're a locationalist, you're going to deny that, which I guess would be to say heaven is a spatial location.
Yeah, yeah. So the locationalists are going to try to put heaven somewhere in space-time, or somewhere such that it has a location within space. The ways in which they do that are different. So contemporaneous accounts of or contemporaneous locationalists want to say that, catch this out, however, somehow heaven's located now. It's something that's presently located. Whereas futurists want to push heaven off into the future and say that it's located somewhere out in the future. There's two different ways that you can do the contemporaneous account. One gets you basically to the rocket ship Jesus picture, that sort of like profane sounding thing that I gave at the beginning, which is that somewhere in these three spatial dimensions that we're familiar with, heaven's there. More sophisticated accounts, like Hudson's, take heaven to be located in a direction that we don't have access to beyond the familiar six directions that we can move in. So we can go up, down, right, left, front, and back. But there's say that there's two other directions because there's a fourth spatial dimension. I think he calls them Ana and Kata. And heaven is located off some way, either in Ana or Kata from us. The analogy that you can draw here is imagine, so let's see here. Imagine that I've got a bunch of, so here's our little Flatlander family that my, let's see here, there we go, that my daughter drew. They can only move front and back, up and down, right? But they're not going to be able to, sorry, I'm camera is in the wrong way.
Yeah, so they're two-dimensional.
Yeah,
so they can move left and right, up and down.
They can move these ways, but they're not going to know what's going on out here, right?
Yeah.
And so that the idea is that that Hudson floats is that heaven is like that to us. We're like Flatlanders. We only exist in a three-dimensional plane, whereas heavenly beings like angels and whatnot exist in, they're hyperspatial things, so they exist in 4 or more spatial dimensions, and they can travel in all these ways that we can't. So you're not going to.
Is that still considered contemporaneous?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because those those directions are all space-like directions that you can travel from here at this moment, or can travel given maybe having a certain geometric shape. So us being three-dimensional things, maybe we can't travel that way, at least naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a version of contemporaneous locationalism. What about futurist locationalism?
Yeah, so the futurist, the easiest way to think about it is at some point God's going to remake the earth and the heavens, and they're going to be together, right? And what you do is you put heaven as located within kingdom come, right? So what happens on this account is that when Christ ascends, he just kind of skips forward to kingdom come. Whereas, and so we can't get there unless if we were able to do some serious time traveling that it doesn't seem like we'd be able to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
there is
I was going to ask what your critique of locationalism is, if you're ready to go to the critique.
Yeah, so I should mention that there's just like there's a hyperspace contemporaneous view, there's a hyperspace futurist view, um, which is that like our time is one amongst many. You basically think of like various timelines as related uh, to each other, as each moment, past and present, would be now. And then on that view, you put heaven off into some sort of future timeline, hyper future timeline, or something like that. I think that there's two different ways. You have to give two different critiques of these different locationalist views. So um, the contemporaneous accounts face a different problem than futurist accounts do. The contemporaneous accounts fall prey to what I like to call technological Pelagianism.
Yeah, that was
So,
such a creative
yeah,
critique, I thought. But it seemed like a good critique to me. So explain this.
yeah. So, what do Pelagians say? Pelagians say that we can gain entry into heaven via our own moral advancements, right? And that's something that if you've read any Augustine, you know that like this is not sat favorably uh, in the history of Christian theology. There's nothing on our own that we can do by our own accord to morally advance ourselves in such a way that we merit entry into heaven. So the claim that I want to do is I want to just generalize a little bit, because if it's the case that like continuously morally like advancing ourselves isn't enough to get us through the heavenly gates, it most certainly shouldn't be the case that mere technological advancements are enough to get us through the heavenly gates or whatever. And let me make one other qualification about the word can. I understand the can in Pelagianism to be a very strong can. It's um, you can't in principle. So there's no like real story that you could tell that could map onto any way the world could ever turn out, such that moral advancement would gain you heavenly entry. And I want to say the same thing has to be true about technological advancement. So it couldn't be the case that, say, in the future, we develop some sort of machine that can rotate us so that we can move in anankata as opposed to up, down, right, left, front, back, that could take us off such that all of a sudden, boom, we're in heaven. However, I think that the contemporaneous accounts of locationalism are going to have to be committed to that being a real possibility and not something that you can't even in principle do.
Okay. What
Yeah.
about your critique of futurist locationalism?
Yeah. So what I think goes wrong with futurist accounts, both the more naive one where it's like just future the kingdom come within our own timeline, or within some sort of like hyper future timeline, is they end up robbing Christ of certain unique statuses that he has. In particular, think of like the paschal greeting that we say every Easter. Um, you're gonna get certain claims to come out as true that shouldn't be true, right? Um, you walk into your Easter service, the pastor gets up and says, "Christ is risen," and you yell, "Christ is risen indeed," right? So, what is it for that claim to be true according to the futurist? Well, according to the futurist, it looks like what's going to have to be true, make that claim true, is that at some future time, namely in future kingdom come, Christ has a resurrection body. But if we generalize out Christ from that and just make it, what is it to say someone is risen? Well, it's for them to have a resurrection body in future kingdom come. It turns out that that's going to be true of every saint. It's true of Peter to say Peter is risen indeed, according to the futurist, because the kinds of ways that they have to spell out what it would be true for Christ to be risen makes it also the case that Peter's risen, makes it the case that any saint is risen. So it robs Christ of this unique status of being truly risen now. Yeah.
Justin Mooney's watching, and he raises another objection to the futurist locationalism, which is actually the same type of objection you raised against contemporaneous locationalism. He says, wouldn't the Pelagian objection also apply to the future account if time travel to the future is at least metaphysically possible?
Yes. Yeah, so you can fold that in together if you think that that kind of time travel is metaphysically possible for us to.
Okay,
Yeah.
so at this point, for the viewers, I've noticed the numbers are gradually growing, so more people are watching. But some people have just come in. So up to this point, we summarized the problem of the ascension. We looked at the first type of response, which is anti-corporealism. And we laid out some reasons that that response doesn't work. And then now we just finished looking at locationalism, the second type of response, saw some reasons that that response doesn't work. Now, you're going to opt for the third solution, which is non-local corporealism. But before we do that, let's talk about ubiquitism. And the reason I do this is the impression I get from reading your paper is that even though very, very little has been written on the problem of the ascension, the other views that we've discussed, there are some proponents of those views, even if their explanations are very brief and what they've written on is very brief. It seems like other proponents have taken the kinds of solutions you've laid out so far. Ubiquitism is also a solution that has been discussed by Martin Luther, is my understanding. So why don't you lay out ubiquitism?
Yeah,
and then
so
we'll go to your solution, which is unique.
Ubiquitism isn't stated originally as a problem to the problem. A solution to the problem of the ascension, as what we've been discussing, but it is something that does work as a way of trying to resolve the problem, and has a long history of theological endorsement, which the other two views do not. So Martin Luther proposed this view when trying to understand how Christ's body and blood can be in the Eucharist. What he says is that when Christ gains a glorified body, the attributes, the divine and human attributes, start to be such that they cross over. And functionally, Christ's body becomes omnipresent. It's located everywhere. Now, there's different ways you can understand this. I mean, there's some sort of like old school theories of location that Martin Luther makes use of, and I don't have a good enough background in that to like really cash out what that is, but you could think of him as like multi-located at every single possible region of space. I think that's probably the closest that we're going to be able to get. It's not like Christ's body just becomes spread out. It's not like it gets really big, so it gets exactly as big as the universe, right? Yeah, and so what this does is if we understand the property of being in heaven as the property of being glorified, and that one of the features of being glorified is just to become located in this way, at least for bodies, then you actually can accept the three claims that I took to be contradictory in the first place, which is you can accept that Christ has a body that has ascended into heaven, right? So his physical body just doesn't have the shape that you'd normally think that it would. It's in heaven because it's glorified. And heaven is not a spatial location. Rather, being in heaven is to gain a certain type of property, namely being glorified. And it doesn't violate materiality because Christ's body is within space. It has a spatial location. In fact, it has way more than one spatial location. It has all of them. And so you get to accept all three of these claims together. And, you know, that, I mean, at first glance, that looks like a pretty nice solution, but I don't think in the end that it is.
Yeah, so go ahead and explain why you think ubiquitism fails.
Yeah, so my in the paper, I don't state my arguments as strongly as I think that they could be stated, but here's a couple of worries that you might have. So you might think that human bodies are disposed to locate in a particular way. Namely, they're disposed to locate at human-shaped regions. So I owe Justin Mooney for this one. This was his his response to it. And so it's super duper weird to say that Christ just from now on is located everywhere. He's never ever again going to be located at a human-shaped region. Or at least if he is, he's also located at all the non-human shaped regions. So his body gaining this extra property of being glorified, of being a glorified body, changes it to be located or disposed to be located in such a way that looks inconsistent with how we should think of human bodies as being disposed to be located in space, how we should think about them as tending to manifest themselves when they're located. So that's one issue with it. The other another issue is, so here's something that seems really intuitive. It seems like there's empty regions of space. Now it's up in the air, depending upon whether you accept some sort of field theory or something like that. But here's a bad result for a theological view. If your theological view by fiat a priori rules out certain physical possibilities, in this case, ubiquitism rules out a priori that at least since the ascension, there could be any empty regions of space. There are no vacuums anywhere. Christ's body fills all of it. That seems like a really bad result. And lastly, there's an issue of theological heterodoxy. I state this is something in terms of theological neutrality. Let's say a solution to a problem is theologically neutral, just so long as more traditions can make use of it. Most traditions consider ubiquitism to be contradictory to the Orthodox view of what it is for Christ to be incarnate. And the reason for this is it has to do with this bleeding over of divine properties into the human nature. And if you go back to the creeds, it says that you have this union. I forget the exact words, but it's like without merging, without confusion, stuff like that. And ubiquitism is traditionally taken to confuse the divine.
Yeah, it's something about not confusing. You must not confuse. I'm thinking of the language in the creeds. It's like, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, so this is something that, like, you know, basically all of your traditional Catholic and Orthodox communities understand, like the no mixing and no blending, no confusion, even is something that like Coptic Monophysite theologians think. Reformed theologians aren't going to accept that. Traditional Anglicans and Episcopalians, lots of Lutherans think that this is in fact theologically problematic. So it's only a very small fraction of Lutherans that get to use this. So on the lighter end, we violate something called theological neutrality. It's not a view that you can use across the board. On the strong end of it, it just turns out that this is something that is theologically heterodox, and we should reject it.
Okay, so my hope is with the remaining time, you
What do we
can
got?
lay
10
out your
minutes?
view and then go to Q&A. So if possible, we'll try to spend 10 to 15 minutes laying out this final view, which is what you defend, and then we'll go to Q&A. All right, so this last one, non-local corporealism, denies the third claim. Let me take down this question. And that third claim is necessarily anything with a physical body has a spatial location. So your proposed solution to this problem is to deny that. Yeah. So explain how you can get away with that.
Yeah. So to be a non-local corporealist, you have to accept that it's metaphysically possible for something to be material and or physical and lack a spatial location, right? And so what my view is for when we want to answer that really basic question, where did Christ's body go? If you want to answer it literally, you can quite literally say nowhere. If we understand the where as a spatial where, right? It's in heaven, but where is it? Well, heaven isn't anywhere, right? And so I have a few different arguments that I think allow us to get this claim off of the ground. I don't know if you want to switch to the next slide.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So the big idea is, so I need to have some sort of way of spelling out how this could be a genuine possibility, that you have something that's both physical and aspatial or non-spatial, right? And so here's the broad sketch of an argument. This is more like a schema that I'm going to fill in with 3 different other arguments. But it goes like this. Premise 1. It's possible for an object to instantiate fundamental physical properties, or just physical properties generally, without having a spatial location. If it's possible for an object to instantiate fundamental physical properties without having a spatial location, then it's possible for an object to be material while failing to be located. Therefore, it's possible for an object to be material while failing to be located, right? So just that scheme is just like a nice, quick, easy modus ponens. Everybody accepts that inference form. So the question is how we're going to fill it in.
Specifically, premise 1.
Premise 1 is the one that I think needs defending. I can say some stuff about premise 2 in the Q&A, but for the most part, I think it's intuitive enough that if an object has physical properties, then it is in fact a physical object or a material object or whatever. So how do we defend premise 1? Well, there's 3 different types of arguments, and they come from 3 different approaches that are all like motivated apart from any like theological considerations, right? So the first makes use of a type of like Humean understanding of modality, where you have no necessary connections between distinct existences. Roughly, the idea works like this. Whenever you have something with a set of intrinsic properties, you can recombine that in across any sort of possible structure that is compatible with you, like dropping it, stuff, in that structure in that way. So like I can't like recombine something that's intrinsically a triangle and drop it in a square region of space, right? So the argument for modal plenitude goes this way. I need to generalize out from space and spatiotemporal structure enough so that I get a type of structure that isn't spatial. It might have some sort of bare topological features. It might not even have that. But this is some sort of world structure that you can go and put objects with intrinsic properties in, right? Now, to get premise one, all I need to do is show that I can drag and drop objects that have fundamental physical properties, right? Well, if you have any point-sized objects, any objects that don't have any sort of spatial extent, so like things at the points of space, and those have fundamental physical properties, I can drag and drop those into this structure that is not a spatial structure. Now, you might think that's not enough. You haven't shown me that you can have composite objects that are material and lack a location. But what all you need to do is take a bunch of these, extensionless objects with fundamental physical properties and drop them all in to that structure and then compose them. Whatever their composite is going to be a composite object that has physical properties, and so we should consider it to be a material object. But then you have a material object that doesn't have a spatial location. So that gets us premise one.
Okay, so that's the argument from modal plenitude.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, what about the dispositional argument? But
yeah, so the dispositional argument works a little bit, it works in a similar way. The dispositional argument takes fundamental physical properties or physical properties generally to be dispositions. And dispositions, so an example would be like this glass is fragile. Is the disposition to be fragile? That means it breaks easily. Its fragility can either be manifest or not manifest, right? So this is going to sound familiar with the manifestationalism stuff. The fragility of the glass is manifest when it's in the kind of conditions where it's going to break. Fundamental physical properties, if we understand them to be dispositions, are going to have various manifestation conditions versus conditions where they don't manifest in the ways that we're familiar with. They might manifest in some sort of other way. Now, what people will do is individuate dispositions by these clusters of manifestation conditions. What all you need to do to show that something that is non-spatial could have physical properties is just say, okay, look, they have these dispositional properties. There's nothing about them that essentially blocks some sort of spatial object from having fundamental physical dispositions. It's just that they wouldn't be in the right manifestation conditions to manifest as we're familiar with in the physical world. So it moves from like what's essential to these properties to what's possible for these properties. It's essential to these properties that they manifest in certain ways under certain conditions. It is not essential to these properties that they are instantiated by an object located in space-time. So then you get the possibility of there being objects with fundamental physical properties, namely these dispositional ones, without being located in space. And so that's the second argument.
Yeah. Okay. And people can ask more in the Q&A if they'd like. For the sake of time, let's go ahead and move to that third argument. So the emergent space-time argument.
Yeah. So the emergent space-time argument is motivated by various understandings of various theories that are popping up in quantum gravity, where it turns out that it looks like at rock bottom, either space-time evaporates, right? There's nothing, you get down to a certain level, and then there's some fundamental stuff below that, fundamental physical stuff, and that stuff is not spatial. And so you'd have to have some sort of non-spatial features of the world that have physical properties, and then space arises from those. So you might think that, like, look, these space emerges out of this non-spatial structure, but it has to do that, would be one sort of thing that you might think. And that's why whatever would be down here would count as physical or material or whatever. But it turns out that there's going to be models of these theories where space-time doesn't evolve at all, or sorry, doesn't emerge from the fundamental structures at all. And you can still have the properties, you know, all of the same sort of properties at the bottom. Namely, like if you don't have enough nodes in your causal network or something like that, you're not going to get a spatial structure. And so the idea is that, like, in these models, you'd have physical objects that lack spatial locations entirely. And that's enough to get one off of the ground. And the reason for that is because if you think that something is a possibility for how our world could actually be, then we should just accept that as a possibility simply.
Okay, so those were 3 arguments for the first premise. And the first premise was just it's possible to have physical properties without having a spatial location. That's the idea. Yeah. And as long as you have that, then it seems like you can deny, let's go back here, you can deny 3. You can say, well, it would be possible then that Jesus have a physical body, but not have a spatial location. And once you deny 3, now you're out of the problem of the ascension. That's one solution. And that's the solution that you find most plausible.
Yeah, I don't think it's, it clearly faces the theological heterodox worries that the other solutions do.
That would be funny if in one of the creeds it was like, if something it has physical properties, it must be located in space-time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if, yeah. But yeah, there's a sense in which you can find something similar popping up in, like, John of Damascus, and then there's a text in Aquinas where he says something very similar to what I'm saying there. So I take that, you know, if Aquinas says it, you're in good hands, basically. Yeah.
Okay, so if you all have a question, go ahead and put it in the live chat, because we're going to wrap up really soon. But my last question for you, Cruz, before we go to the Q&A is this. We've had an hour-long discussion. I like making these 60-second videos that are kind of like a teaser for the interview. So if possible, can you summarize the problem of the ascension and your solution to it in just 60 seconds?
Okay, let me give this a try. Yeah, so Christ ascended to heaven bodily. Where did his body go? Where is it? If you think that his body went somewhere, then it seems like heaven's a location. But that seems to run us into some issues. If you think he gave up his body, then you could think that heaven isn't some sort of physical location. But then we have to accept that there's a bodiless Christ, which looks like a dead Christ. The solution that I like is that, as surprising as it may be, Christ, his body can be non-located, and so can be in heaven without having a spatial location. How's that?
That was good. Yeah, good job. All right. We've got one question here from Jamie Russell. How much sense, if any, does it have to make to the original audience? Oh, okay. So they're basically, this person's basically like, your solution, would that be something that the original people that are, you know, are watching Jesus go up in heaven, is that what they would think? If does it have to, do they have to have your solution?
I'm not sure how well I can answer this without potentially butchering a bunch of ancient cosmology, but from what I understand is, like, the cosmos is located within some sort of dome, right? And the thought is that Christ's body went on beyond that dome, right? And so it's very similar. It's not like there's any matter or material space within there. Aristotelians at the time understood location as place, right? And to have a place is to have something surrounding your outsides, right? And I think it would be very natural for them to want to say that Christ's body doesn't have a place.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting response. So there are more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and go to those, but that's more could be said there. Okay, Justin Mooney asked, how about responding to the Pelagian worry by saying that being in a certain location is necessary but not sufficient for being in heaven?
Okay. Yeah, he always asks this question. So what I say I'm up to in the paper is trying to spell out some way in which the locationist view, especially the contemporaneous locationism, seems profane in a particular way. This is why Haldane accepts a anti-corporealist view about the Assumption of Mary. He thinks that there's some sort of way in which saying that like Mary's body traveled out into hyperspace seems profane, right? And in particular, it seems like it should not be within our limits, even within sci-fi scenarios, to be able to wander off and run into heaven, whether or not that counts as meriting salvation. It doesn't seem like that should be a possibility for us.
Okay, and the question somewhat related to that response. Kito asks, does the hyperspace solution face the technology objection? In principle, we could travel through the extra spatial dimension. Seems like any locational solution faces this objection.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that if you're going to locate heaven at some place that we could in principle reach through some sort of advancement, whether it be like a sci-fi technology advancement or not, I think you're going to run into that problem.
Okay. Hayden Stephan asked, can you put up the 3 claims of the argument again? Sure. So here they are. Bodily Ascension. Let me take your question down so you can see. Bodily Ascension, that's the first claim. That says Christ has a physical body and it's entirely in heaven. Second claim is heaven is not a spatial location. Third claim is necessarily anything with a physical body has a spatial location. By 1 and 2, so the way that you get a contradiction is by 1 and 2, Christ has a spatial location, but by 1 and 3, Christ does not have a spatial location. Hopefully that answers your question there, Hayden. Okay, let me go back to this screen. Could the hyperspace theory address trinitarian puzzles, like the persons of God exist in 3 dimensions, but are Unitarian in nature?
I don't think so. I don't see how that would work. I think that would require thinking about divinity in too spatialized of a way.
All right, that looks like the final question. So thank you so much, Cruz, for coming on. This was a fun conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to talk about it.
Go and check out my playlist on some other doctrines, like the doctrine of the Incarnation, the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of the Atonement. There's lots of philosophical theology on this channel, so I would encourage you to go check those out as well. And a playlist on models of the resurrection. So plenty there for you to chew on. And thanks for watching. See you next time.